I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, ongoing response to Peter Beinart's call for an end to the State of Israel to be replaced by a binational polity of Jews and Palestinians he calls Israel-Palestine. In case you haven't seen Beinart's piece and the controversy it's fomented, let me summarize it briefly for you. First, Peter Beinart is perhaps the leading intellectual of the hard left in the Jewish community. He's closely aligned with J Street and is one of the most prominent columnists and writers on the American Jewish scene. A graduate of Yale and a Rhodes Scholar, Beinart was the former editor of The New Republic, appears regularly as a pundit on CNN, and has published 3 books, the most notable being The Crisis of Zionism. Currently, Peter Beinart is editor-at-large for a progressive, secular, Jewish quarterly magazine and news site called Jewish Currents, which is where he published his lengthy piece explaining why he has come to reject his long-championed commitment to a two-state solution in favor of this new entity he calls Israel-Palestine. By the way, it should be noted that Peter Beinart is a modern Orthodox Jew. His children have attended the Heschel Day School in Manhattan, and his criticisms of Israel's occupation of the West Bank, of Israel's settlement policy, and of Israel's treatment of Palestinians, which he describes as brutal and undemocratic, have always been couched in a context of his love for the State of Israel and for his only wanting Israel to live up to its goal of being both a Jewish and a democratic state, which he has contended is the only way to ensure Israel's survival. And to all those in the Jewish community who say the Palestinian leadership has no interest in a two-state solution, Beinart contends that the Palestinians have already agreed in principle to living alongside the State of Israel in a West Bank state of their own, but that the only state Palestinians would accept is one that would have full sovereignty and reject any two-state plan that would require the Palestinian state to be demilitarized. But now Peter Beinart has taken a hard left turn and now believes Israel's settlement policy and its talk of annexing parts of the West Bank have so destroyed any possibility of the creation of a viable Palestinian state that he's abandoned his commitment to a sovereign state of Israel and instead speaks only of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, where in this Israel-Palestine, both Jews and Palestinians would be equal. As Peter writes in his piece, the essence of Zionism is not a Jewish state in the land of Israel. It's a Jewish home in the land of Israel, a thriving Jewish society that both offers Jews refuge and enriches the entire Jewish world. It's time to explore other ways to achieve that goal, from confederation to a democratic binational state that don't require subjugating another people. It's time to envision a Jewish home that is a Palestinian home too. And I would add that on a personal note, in my dealings with Peter, he has only been lovely, open to meaningful dialogue. Many of you may have seen him on L'Chaim when he came out with his book, The Crisis of Zionism. And when he published an excerpted version of his piece in the New York Times, we invited Peter to come on JBS to discuss the controversial position he's now taking. Peter politely explained he simply doesn't have the time. Well, again, there are many in the Jewish world who have profound disagreements with Peter's stand. And one of them has written his own powerful critique of Peter Beinart's position, which he's published in Newsweek Online. It's by the man who has been for many decades Israel's most articulate defender, Alan Dershowitz, Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School and the author of, among scores of other books, Guilt by Accusation and Defending Israel. And in Alan's Newsweek response to Peter Beinart, he begins with this opening sentence. Peter Beinart's advocating the end of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people is a study in historical ignorance, willful deception, and arrogant rejection of democracy. And as always, I'm most pleased to be joined once again by Alan Dershowitz. Alan, thank you so much for making time again to speak with the JBS audience.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be on with you because you always ask the best questions and you always are fair, and you really provide an enormously useful service to the American Jewish community and your listeners.
Alan, you write a superb piece for Newsweek. And before you speak about the way in which Beinart's position may be historically ignorant, I want you to explain what you mean when you say that Peter Beinart is guilty of, and these are your words, willful deception.
Oh, it's willful deception throughout the piece. If you read the piece, you would never know, for example, that Israel accepted, that is the pre-Israeli state, Ben Gurion, the Jews of Palestine, accepted the Peel Commission report, which gave them a non-contiguous, tiny little state, much smaller than the Palestinians would get if they accepted the peace offers that had been offered them by the United Nations, by Ehud Barak and Clinton, by Ehud Olmert. He just erases history. He makes it sound as if it's the Israelis that have prevented the Palestinians from getting a state. They could have had a state in 1937, 1947, 1948, 1967, 1990, 2000, 2001, 2008, and they can get one today if they would sit down and negotiate. So it's willful, deliberate deception. You call him an intellectual. That's damning him, because if he is in fact an intellectual, then he's a liar. Because if he knows all these things and denies his readers the right to that information, and I know a lot of people who have read his article who are not very sophisticated or knowledgeable, and they believe it because they don't hear anything about how Israel has been offering the Palestinians a state over and over and over again. And as Abi Ibn put it, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and they don't know how to take yes for an answer. The only point I'd like to correct you on is when you say that Beinart believes in a state that's both democratic and Jewish. He believes in neither. Let me be very clear. Let me tell you a story that proves that Peter Beinart has no interest in democracy. He doesn't care about democracy. Here's the story. I'm debating him on Martha's Vineyard. It must be 10 years ago. And he starts the debate by saying, Alan, you were one of my heroes. I was part of the Soviet Jewry movement. You were very active in the Soviet Jewry movement. You helped get Sharansky out, many of the others out. You helped bring 1 million Jews to Israel. And now I'm so disappointed in you, he said, because you support Israel, even though Israel has moved to the right. And I said, Peter, do you understand what you're saying? Think about it for a minute. Why has Israel moved to the right? Because of the Soviet Jewry movement. Because 1 million Jews who had lived under communist oppression came to Israel and moved the country from the left to the right. What would you do, Peter? Send them back? What would you do? Not allow them to vote? Peter Beinart doesn't care one bit about democracy. He is a Platonic guardian. He is a know-it-all. He thinks that he knows what's best for the Israelis and what's best for the Palestinians. The fact that no Israeli leaders and almost no one in the Israeli population accepts his idea of one state with a Jewish little homeland, a Bantustan homeland, the fact that none of the leaders of the Palestinian Authority accept it, he doesn't care. He's right. Democracy doesn't matter. Polls don't matter. Votes don't matter. Only Beinart matters. Now, why wouldn't it be a Jewish state? It wouldn't be, because once there was an Israel-Palestine, Palestine-Israel, immediately there would be a demographic war. Who would have the majority? Like in Lebanon. And in Lebanon, the Muslims won the demographic war. The Christians lost it, and there are no Christians to speak of left in Lebanon. The same thing happened in the Gaza Strip and on the West Bank. There are virtually no Christians to speak of. So you'd have a demographic war. The Jews would lose it. The Muslims would win it. And a Palestinian state, according to the constitution of the Palestinian state, would be a Muslim state governed by Sharia law. It would mark the end of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. The arrogance of Beinart to ignore what Jews have been working for a century, more than a century and a quarter. I mean, Zionism starts way before Herzl, but even beginning with Herzl. The Jews have worked so hard to get a state. And Beinart, on the pages of the New York Times, is willing to abolish it with the flip of a pen. It's so arrogant. I mean, I would use the word chutzpah, but I actually like the word chutzpah, and I therefore won't use it in describing Beinart. He willfully misinforms as well. He talks about two experiments in history where we've had binational states, and they're both utterly irrelevant. One is South Africa. It's not a binational state. South Africa was a colonialist regime dominated by a tiny percentage of whites. Nelson Mandela, who I helped to represent and who I admired enormously, overthrew that peacefully, by the way, without terrorism in the end. And now it's a largely Black African country, and but it's not a binational state in any sense of that term. The other one he talks about is Northern Ireland. Totally irrelevant. Northern Ireland, ethnically, the people of Northern Ireland are the same. They're all British, Anglo-Saxons. They look the same. They have very similar values. Some are Catholic, some are Protestants. But religion is far, far less important today in Northern Ireland. It's a secular state. It now is one of the leading countries allowing and encouraging abortion, birth control. Religion is less important. And so it was very easy for my friend George Mitchell to help bring about peace in Northern Ireland. Israel would be much more like the failed binational, bi-religious states. Beinart never mentions India, Pakistan. You read his article, it's as if today India still includes Pakistan. Obviously, that binational, bi-religious state broke up with enormous amount of bloodshed. Another one was Yugoslavia. You could search the article from top to bottom. It's the leading example of a multinational, multi-religious state. Tito put together a fake state, created marriages where they shouldn't have existed between Bosnia and Serbia, Herzegovina and Croatia. What happened? Genocide, massive genocide. Now they've been divorced and they're in peace because they're separate, not because they're together. And so I don't mind having an argument with Beinart. I wish you were here today, but he just is deceptive. He is not an intellectual. He doesn't put the truth and the facts on the table and then say decide. He deceives his readers. He looks down at his readers. He says to them essentially, you're not as well-read or as intelligent as I am, so I'm going to deceive you and prevent you from learning the facts. Let me give you another thing he never mentions in the article. The armed forces, Israel's nuclear arsenal. Who gets it in Israel-Palestine? It would be a disaster. The idea of a Jewish homeland, first of all, he is so totally ignorant of the history of Zionism, so totally ignorant. Sure, Herzl was prepared to accept something less than a state because that's all he could get. He was prepared to go and take Cyprus. He even talked about the possibility of Uganda, ultimately rejected it. All he wanted was a foothold. He went to Egypt and met with the Egyptian leaders and said, give me something in the Sinai around El Arish. But it was all designed ultimately to get a place where the Jews could defend themselves, where they could have autonomy. The idea that a little Jewish Bantus land surrounded by a Palestinian state, which would be a Palestinian state, living at the sufferance of the Muslim majority, which would have the armed forces and presumably the nuclear weapon. And Israel would have this little homeland where it could teach Jewish culture and Jewish values. Ahad Ha'am talked about that, but he was smart enough to understand, and post-Shoah, we're all smart enough to understand that you really have to look at the Psalms. You really have to look at what King David said. Hashem oz li amo yutain. Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. God will give the Jewish people strength And only from strength will there be peace. The reason there's peace in the Middle East today is that Israel has an army, a navy, an air force, an intelligence service, a high-tech service that is qualitatively superior to all the surrounding Arab armies together. If that ever stopped, there would be genocide. That's why after a lot of thought and a lot of concern, I named my piece Beinart's Final Solution. I never use the Holocaust as an analogy, but this is a final solution to Israel. This does not solve the Israel-Palestine conflict. It creates a final solution, which he admits, the end of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people.
Yes.
It is a disgrace, and I renew my challenge to him. Come on the show. Let's have it out. But the final point is, how dare you tell the Israeli people what they should accept? How dare you tell mothers and fathers who have lost their children defending Israel? I have a cousin, an only child of Holocaust survivors, who died defending Israel. I have so many friends who've lost children defending Israel. How dare you tell them that you know better than them? And you're going to want them to live in a little surrounded Jewish homeland where they'll produce literature and leave it to the great Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims to protect them. That's the past history. That's what Herzl saw in Europe. And that's what Herzl said, never again. And he said, if you dream it, it is not a fairy tale. He dreamt it. Zionism was established on the blood and the backs of hardworking chalutzim and people who build a nation from scratch. And now Beinart on the pages of the New York Times wants to abolish it. Thankfully, Israel's future and the future of the Palestinians will be decided on the ground by Israelis and by Palestinians, not in the operating rooms of the New York Times, not in academia, and not in the mind of Peter Beinart.
By the way, Alan, the critics of those on the far left, of the Beinarts and of J Street, of the New Israel Fund, they've always said that deep down, they don't believe in the legitimacy of the state of Israel, that these people don't really love Israel, that it's not appropriate for them to say they are pro-Israel, and that in truth, they're ready to sacrifice Israel on the altar of what they perceive to be justice for the Palestinians. And in some way, Beinart's rejection now of the state of Israel seems to prove the critics of the far left to be right. To what extent do you feel Beinart's piece will do damage to the credibility of the far left, to J Street, groups like the New Israel Fund?
I'd be interested to know whether J Street supports it. I would hope not. I would hope the New Israel Fund wouldn't support it. I would hope that Beinart would be relegated to the wastebasket of American Jewish history, where his article and where he now belongs. He has given up any right to speak as a pro-Israel person. He's now an anti-Israel person. He's now Norman Finkelstein. He's now Noam Chomsky. He's now somebody who rejects the concept of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, something that the vast majority of Americans, the vast, vast, vast majority of Israelis accept. Many more Palestinians accept it, but he rejects it. And his notion is so absurd. What he would substitute for Israel is so childish, so absurd. And it wouldn't give justice to the Palestinians because the wars would continue. You think the Israelis are going to just accept this, take away their guns, take away their nuclear weapons? It isn't justice for the Palestinians. I believe in justice for the Palestinians. I have advocated a two-state solution since 1967. I was the first prominent Jew to come out against the Israeli government and say a two-state solution is the right thing. I favor the Alon plan, in which Israel would have taken over the areas of the West Bank which are essential to its survival and national security, but not send in civilian settlements. So I'm the liberal here. By the way, Beinart's not a liberal. He's not a leftist. He believes that the government should support yeshivas. He believes the government should pay for parochial schools and promote religion. That's so anti-civil libertarian. He is not a strong supporter of freedom of speech. You never hear him speak out on behalf of freedom of speech on university campuses. He's a knee-jerk identity politics, left-wing guy. Remember, left-wingers are not liberals. left-wingers are anti-liberals. Liberals believe in due process, freedom of speech, open debate. He's not that. He's a leftist. And he, you say, would sacrifice Israel for the justice of the Palestinians. No, he would sacrifice Israel for getting invited to dinner parties at universities and being hailed. He's going to now get invited all over the country for big fees to speak on college campuses and make the case against Israel. This is extraordinarily self-serving. He's not doing it because of justice for the Palestinians. If he really believed in justice for the Palestinians, why doesn't he speak out on the Kurds? Why doesn't he speak out on the Tibetans? Why doesn't he speak out on the other displaced people around the world? It's not that he's so pro-Palestinian. It's that he's anti-Israel. But he doesn't believe in Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people.
Well, that is now clear. But you do not think, you don't expect J Street and New Israel Fund to back him?
Well, you know, J Street backed Goldstone when he issued that blood libel, Goldstone.
So what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I would expect that they would come up with some wishy-washy, mealy-mouthed response in which they say, it's important to have dialogue and debate. We subscribe to his ideas to let's continue the discussion and debate, but we don't agree with every aspect of his proposal and plan, but we welcome him into the dialogue and into the big tent of people who have been debating these issues since Ahad Ha'am fought with Theodore Herzl at the Second Zionist Convention. That's what J Street will say.
We only have a couple minutes left, and I want to ask you a related question.
Yeah.
And it also has to do with your sense of hate speech, free speech inside the Jewish community. Peter did a video interview with Marwan Barghouti, the founder of BDS, at NYU, where he simply gave Barghouti a platform. He did not have anyone with him to debate Barghouti.
Yeah. So
how do you feel about that?
The best proof that Peter Beinart is anti-Israel and anti-Zionist is the fact that Barghouti will debate him. Barghouti was invited to Oxford to debate me at the Oxford Union. He said, I can't debate Dershowitz because he's a Jewish Zionist. He supports Israel. And BDS doesn't allow me to debate a supporter of Israel. The fact that he would debate or dialogue with Peter Beinart is the best proof that he now regards Beinart as anti-Israel because he won't debate anybody who's pro-Israel. And I would debate, I'd debate anybody. I'd debate Barghouti. I would point out the hypocrisy of how the BDS movement, you know, the Palestinian Authority doesn't support BDS because it hurts Palestinians more than it hurts Israelis. You know, the BDS movement singles out one group of people for boycott. It's not a movement. It doesn't boycott human rights violators. It only boycotts Jewish Israelis or American Jews who support Israel. So I don't criticize him for having a debate if it was a real debate with Barghouti.
It was not a debate. He just gave Barghouti a platform at NYU without anyone to really challenge Barghouti. Do you think there's anything wrong with Beinart going to NYU and giving Barghouti a platform without it being in the context of a debate?
Yes, I think there's something wrong with it. It would be like giving Ahmadinejad a platform from Iran or the head of Hezbollah or the head of Hamas. No, you don't give them a platform. I debate them. A lot of people don't agree with debating them. I've always debated. I debated Meir Kahane. I would have debated Yasser Arafat. I would have debated anybody. I believe in debate and dialogue, but I don't believe in giving people platforms to spew out hatred without challenging them and without confronting them. Again, let me renew my invitation to Beinart if he has the courage to come on at your show and debate me. You set the rules. You set the terms. Let's have a debate. Let's see if he can answer some hard questions instead of just preaching to people who don't know as much and withholding all the information necessary for those people to form wise judgments. He left out so much from that article. He's going to say, look, it's only an op-ed, but the selective editing of history in order to create a false narrative is what led me to call him willfully deceptive. I stand by those words.
We had Daniel Gordis on, and Daniel Gordis challenged American Jewish leadership to say, in essence, Peter, you've crossed the line, and now really we're done with you. And he then said, I wonder if American Jewish leadership has the strength to do that. What do you think American Jewish leadership's response to Beinart's going to be?
Oh, I think it's going to be criticism among some, sharp criticism, obviously, by some, more muted criticism by others. But generally, welcome to the debate. We're happy to have your point of view. We don't necessarily accept your point of view. But it's interesting because much of American Jewish leadership has tried to reject and marginalize Mort Klein, the head of the Zionist Organization of America, because he has views well to the right. And they're embarrassed by his views. And they probably won't try to marginalize Beinart because they're afraid of alienating Jewish kids on the left in colleges and universities. The most frightening thing about Beinart's views is that they will be appealing to young, ignorant Jewish students on American college campuses who know nothing about the history of Israel, but who want to be popular among their friends. I wrote my book, The Case for Israel, because a kid came to me and said, I never defend Israel on campus because I'm afraid if I do, I will become unpopular. Today, it takes no courage to be anti-Israel on campus. It takes an enormous amount of courage to be pro-Israel. And Beinart has now become the darling. He's given legitimacy to the anti-Israel hard left. He will go down in history as one of the most negative forces when Israel is struggling to achieve peace and to achieve a reasonable resolution of the Israeli-Arab, Israeli-Palestine resolution. He will end up in the wastebasket of history, condemned by history, condemned by Jewish and American historians who will see his efforts as self-serving, selfish, and encouraging hatred of Israel. He will encourage the hard left to become even more anti-Israel than it is today, because they'll be able to say, look, Peter Beinart thinks there shouldn't be Israel. Why should there be Israel? Let's end Israel. Let's end the nation state of the Jewish people. Let's impose the final solution on the nation state of the Jewish people, the end of Israel. That's Beinart.
Alan, that was fabulous. You are fabulous. I hope everybody reads your piece online, Newsweek, but I hope they've heard what you had to say. You say it eloquently, and you remain, I'll say this over and over, you remain Israel's strongest defender, and you're always welcome here on JBS. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. Normally I'm less angry, but I have to tell you, I am really, really angry at Peter Beinart, who I've known for a long time. He really crossed the line into anti-Israel advocacy, and he will cause an enormous amount of harm among young people on college campuses today.
Thank you, Alan. The thoughts of Alan Dershowitz, Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School, author of Guilt by Accusation and Defending Israel. And he is a devoted and brilliant defender of the State of Israel. I hope you enjoyed hearing his response to Peter Beinart. By the way, some viewers have sent me emails asking me what my position is on Peter Beinart's piece. I find it outrageous. I also find it astounding. I just can't believe he would write a piece calling for the end of the State of Israel. And I agree completely with Danny Gordis and with Alan Dershowitz. He's more than wrong. He's betrayed his own sense of loyalty to the State of Israel and the Jewish people. My thanks as always to our director Sloan Copeland, JBS's managing director Dara Golub, transmission manager John McDevitt, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Stay safe and be well, my friends.